seminar in the series. This is a seminar that is organized by graduate students and supported by NRAGS, the MSP LTER, and the Forest Resources Department. And so if anyone is looking for a recording of this later, it does get uploaded to the Forest Resources YouTube page, so you can access this later. Today's speaker is going to be Dr. Kristin Dobbin. So Dr. Kristin Dobbin is an assistant professor of cooperative extension at the University of California, Berkeley, in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. Her research considers planning and policymaking for water justice at multiple scales, focusing primarily on drinking water access, quality, and sustainability in California. Through collaborations with community partners, Dr. Dobbin works to conduct research that empowers impacted communities as the leaders and experts in achieving a vision of sustainable and equitable water management. Prior to joining the faculty at Berkeley, she completed her PhD studying environmental policy and human ecology at the University of California, Davis, and was an NSF postdoctoral fellow at UCLA's Luskin Center for Innovation. Kristin, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to share.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks everyone for being here. It's really fun to engage kind of across the country in these kind of new ways that virtual seminars allow us to do, and I'm really excited to be here in conversation with you all. I know a little bit about some of the projects happening at UM from various colleagues, and it's really exciting to be invited to talk with you all today. I will go ahead and share my screen. I think that looks good. I guess I can dive in and get started. The title of my presentation today is Leveraging Policy and Governance Research for Water Justice in California. And I'm going to talk a fair amount in this talk about cooperative extension, which is my new role at UC Berkeley. And so kind of before I dive in, I'll share a little bit more about me and how I come to this work. So I am very new in my position at UC Berkeley. I just started this fall, but I've been working in water justice in California for about 8 years, and even more broadly on rural drinking water access and equity for even longer. So I am, as Katie mentioned, a social scientist. I specifically focus on understanding policy and governance, both as a cause of and a potential solution to environmental injustice. And I'm really interested in the tensions kind of between those two aspects, thinking of governance very much as a root cause of our environmental injustices in California, but also as a potential solution. And how can both of those things be true at once? So UC Berkeley sits on Huchun territory in the lands of the Ohlone people. And I also acknowledge that the work I'll cover today really spans the whole swath of California, with lands of countless other tribes, both recognized and unrecognized. And I think in the context of giving it a land acknowledgement, it's also important for me to say up front that I represent UC Berkeley and UC Cooperative Extension, which are both direct products of settler colonialism. And this is something I'm going to talk a little bit more about in this talk, but it's something I really want to center when I am introducing myself in spaces, and a role and a positionality I'm like really learning and thinking a lot about right now as I start this new role. So my presentation today has 3 parts. I am going to start by talking a bit about how I'm thinking about my research and extension philosophy. And this might be a little high level, but I am really excited by the opportunity to think about not just the work we do, but how we do our work. And I thought this would be a good group to do that with. And again, I am very new to my position, so I don't have the answers to what research and extension should look like. But I really do want to do the work of reckoning with the history of land grant and being intentional about who and how I serve in this role. From there, I will dive into talking about some of my own work on California's groundwater reform process and the implications for environmental justice. And this will hopefully provide kind of a more concrete demonstration of the philosophy that I talked about previously and how I'm currently implementing it. And then I'm going to end with just a really brief, short discussion of challenges and questions that I continue to wrestle with in this work. And those are really also intended to be kind of turned back to you all. And I look forward to potentially having a conversation about some of those points of tension and challenges in doing kind of equity-centered impact work. So in order to talk about how I'm approaching extension work, I think it's first important to talk about the creation of the land grant system and cooperative extension. And I know that as a land grant institution yourselves, like many of you might be familiar with this history, but just bear with me because I'll be pretty quick about it. So in 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Act, which distributed public domain lands to raise funds for higher education, specifically those universities that became known as land grant universities. And this was in essence a massive wealth transfer from expropriating land of tribal nations into US higher education. And later in 1914, we passed the Smith-Lever Act, which established a national cooperative extension service, which is in essence a partnership between USDA and land grant universities to facilitate outreach programming. Kind of the original intent of this is outreach for agricultural practices and agricultural technologies, in essence to create a kind of a program of home instruction or even farm-based instruction. And so this photo here comes from the award-winning High Country News Land Grab U investigation. And it shows all the parcels of land, mostly from the Sioux, that were endowed to the University of Minnesota. And if we adjusted, they adjusted for inflation, they estimate that these lands were worth more than $10.5 million. And with their Land Grab U map, you can find this information for any land grant university in the US. So this is what it looks like for the University of California. And this history is important because it directly informs what extension looks like today. So according to the University of California Cooperative Extension, our mission is to enhance the quality of life and environmental and economic well-being of citizens of California through research and education. And this is a really cool infographic that my colleague Ellen Bruno created that lays out how cooperative extension is structured in California. So we have a network of more than 300 campus-based specialists, which is what I am, and then county-based advisors who work together to improve the lives of Californians, through applied research and information sharing. So I come to this work really dedicated to that vision at a high level. I truly believe and continue to do research exactly because I think research can and should play an important role in developing and implementing water justice solutions. But I also have some discomforts and critiques around extension. So the traditional model of extension is often unidirectional, with the university and research kind of providing information to the public via outreach, which kind of implicitly assumes that the university is the source of knowledge. And that's usually knowledge incubated on university campuses. And for me, in contrast, community water managers and impacted residents are really themselves knowledge producers and experts that are absolutely critical to solving water injustice. So pictured here is a meeting we had between state officials and local community water leaders around groundwater reform in California. And the intention of this meeting was not to just have state agency officials talk to community members about what they're doing and why, but really to have community members share their experiences with the process and their recommendations directly to state agency members, state agency staff, I should say. So another challenge with the traditional model of extension, and again, I'm saying traditional model, I recognize there's a huge diversity across extension. There's lots of people doing various formats of extension that deviate from this. But the traditional model of extension really has had a very limited reach, in large part because of the agricultural roots of land grant universities. Extension has historically, and I would argue still today, primarily serves agricultural communities, and beyond that, primarily serves landowners. And right now in California, we are just in the process of hiring our first cooperative extension staff that will focus on Native American communities. And my position, which just was filled last year, is really the first of its kind on safe and affordable drinking water access within the system, and one of the first, if not the first position to be explicitly framed as an environmental justice hire, which I think kind of speaks both to kind of where speaks to both kind of where the limitations and who we have served have been, but also to the fact that we're in a very exciting moment of cooperative extension in California. And I've heard across the country, we're in a very exciting moment of cooperative extension that's kind of growing the communities that we serve and the topics we work on. And there are a lot of cooperative extension specialists and advisors that are transforming how we do our work towards a more co-production model, where communities or other stakeholders aren't just involved on the back end of receiving information, but are really kind of integrated into the research process the entire way. And that's the approach I take to my research and extension, and like kind of the philosophy I'm forming around this. So my approach really tries to integrate research and extension iteratively through every phase of every project that I do. And part of the reason for this, and I'm going to talk about this more as I get into some of my actual research, is that I see the two to be mutually informing, but also mutually benefiting. And so doing it in this iterative cycle, I think really has a lot of benefits. So for me, this starts with my goals. As a cooperative extension specialist and maybe a non-traditional academic, I don't just aim to advance our understanding of water injustice, but I actually aim to help advance access to safe, affordable, and accessible drinking water in California, working alongside my partners. So to do this, I employ community-based or engaged research. And obviously community-based and engaged research is a really big umbrella topic. There's a lot of diversity in that. But for me, there's kind of like two core characteristics that make something community engaged or community-based research. And that is that it's community-driven and action-oriented. So I really try to center those two things in my research. I also leverage practices of public scholarship and scholar activism. I think sometimes when I say, especially the latter one, people kind of like look at me like deer in the headlights. What I mean by those two things is that I don't just strive to produce research for consumption and use outside of the academy, which I think is the mission of cooperative extension, to produce knowledge that can be used kind of in applied situations on the ground. But I also participate in that dissemination and application. So whether that's in policy meetings, whether that's in community meetings, I don't just want to produce something and say, here, run with it. I want to actually, I try to actually be involved in the implementation, which then feeds back into new research questions, new research insights, and kind of continues that loop. So in what this looks like in my research kind of in practice really is diverse. Like there's a lot of different ways you can do these core things in any given project. And I think I'll demonstrate that in just a minute with some examples from my own research. But before I get into that, I think there's kind of three things that I do consistently across my projects that I thought might be worth sharing. And the first of those things is the triangulation of research questions. So that is developing research questions, not just based on scholarly or intellectual questions, but also on what non-academic collaborators want to know, as well as on considerations of whose interests are served by knowing. And I think that last question in particular is important for those of us in land-grant and extension affiliations, given, the public service mission of land-grant and extension. So another defining feature of my work is kind of ongoing communication and collaboration with stakeholders. And I think it's worth stressing that I do this formally through collaborative projects and through coalitions, but I also do this informally. I dedicate a lot of time and attention to building and maintaining personal relationships and kind of staying in ongoing communication and coordination with stakeholders, even outside of specific projects. And then the last thing that's kind of core to every project I do is the development of a variety of different outputs. So for me, this is really important because it recognizes that different stakeholders have different needs and different interests. And it also can help address the mismatch in timelines between research, like academic research on one side, and community or policy efforts on the other, which can really create disconnects between the two and can really limit the impact of research. So while I may have a peer-reviewed publication under review going through that process, I also have fact sheets or research briefs or various other products that can serve to get that information out on a quicker timeline. So with that, then kind of a high level thinking about how I'm trying to approach this work and how I focus some of my research and extension efforts, I'll transition to talking specifically about some of my research regarding the implementation of California's historic groundwater reform law. So we know this law as the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA. And this is work that started as my dissertation at UC Davis, and then is something I've continued to work on for the last few years, and honestly probably will continue to work on forever, as you'll see in just a second why. So SGMA was signed by Governor Brown in September 2014, and the intent was, just as the name implies, to provide for the sustainable management of the state's groundwater resources. The law officially went into effect on January 2015, and it applies to all of the state's high and medium priority groundwater basins, which are shown in this map in the yellow and the orange. And the implementation of SGMA consists of 3 distinct steps. The first is that local agencies were required to form groundwater sustainability agencies, known as GSAs, by June 2017. So they had about 2.5 years to do that. Secondly, GSAs had until 2020 or 2022, depending on their local groundwater conditions, to write a groundwater sustainability plan. And those plans have to define groundwater sustainability locally based on several hydrologic criteria. And then they have to outline plans for monitoring, management actions, and programs and projects, that will achieve those goals. And finally, GSAs have 20 years to implement their plans and achieve their local definition of sustainability. So passing SGMA was a really huge effort. It had been tried several times in the past to do groundwater reform in California. It had always failed. And it passed this time in part because of the historic drought that we were in the middle of that really forced policymakers' hands, but also because this particular legislation was supported by a diverse coalition of actors, which included environmental justice advocates. And environmental justice advocates have subsequently been super involved in the implementation of the law. And their investment, time and resources over many, many years, really reflects the critical importance of groundwater in shaping drinking water access in the state. So a good demonstration of this is the fact that since we started keeping track as a state in 2013, California has recorded nearly 4,000 household water outages, which are mapped here on the left. We also have more than 700,000 Californians that are served non-compliant drinking water from public water systems, most of which are entirely dependent on groundwater for their water supply. And then, of course, we have a lot of Californians, an unknown number, who are reliant on contaminated water through domestic wells, which is not regulated and therefore kind of lacks clear statistics in the state. But we know there's a lot of people out there who are relying on kind of decentralized groundwater infrastructure. And all of this disproportionately impacts low-income communities of color, which means that California's groundwater-fueled drinking water crisis is also an environmental justice crisis. So this means that how SGMA is implemented has implications for access to safe and affordable drinking water, and ultimately for advancing California's human right to water, which was passed 3 years prior in 2012. However, residents like the Hernandez family of West Goshen, who are pictured here at the state capitol, have historically been excluded from and even mapped out of water management, which of course has contributed to these unjust and unsustainable conditions. And so my earliest SGMA research from 2017 and 2018 indicated that this history seemed to be repeating itself with SGMA. So I analyzed the governance structures of newly created groundwater sustainability agencies, and I found that only 17% or nearly 250, only 17% of the nearly 250 small low-income communities in the region were formally represented on GSA boards. And this kind of added urgency to this question of how SGMA implementation would and could influence drinking water access in the state. So my ongoing research on this topic triangulates between these scholarly gaps on the questions of source water protection and water access, as well as policy and organizing priorities from my partner organizations. And I do this work in kind of close coordination with two grassroots environmental justice organizations, Community Water Center and Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, as well as one technical assistance organization known as Self-Help Enterprises. There are a lot of components to the work that we've done and continue to do. And so I'm just going to focus on a few elements here today. The first is that in order to understand and advance community participation in SIGMA, I conducted 27 semi-structured interviews with community leaders and community-based organizations, and really tried to get at the heart of what was impeding community participation, because by this point we had documented that community representation and community participation was really low. So we wanted to understand what was impeding community participation and where might there be opportunities to change that. So in addition to a lot of other really interesting findings, we were able to identify 6 shared challenges that were really limiting community involvement across the state. And among these were challenges with the accessibility and transparency of the process. So one interviewee told me, quote, "It's just this cloak of non-transparency. In all those SIGMA meetings, there's always another meeting after the meeting where the big districts sort things out." And interviewees were also really aware of and very frustrated often by their lack of formal voting representation, as I mentioned earlier, which was really, really limited. And a few interviewees even reported that they stopped attending meetings because they thought that without a vote on the board, their presence or their participation just simply didn't matter. Most interviewees I talked to reported that there was very limited opportunities to provide any input. Like even if they attended the meetings, they reported that meetings were really kind of like unidirectional updates, reports, and there was no opportunity for discussion, collaboration, input, etc. And lastly, when in the cases where people did report that there was discussion and conversation among people attending these meetings, interviewees almost always reported that drinking water was implicitly or explicitly omitted from the conversation. So sometimes it just wasn't brought up. And other times when interviewees would bring up drinking water themselves, they would be told by staff or board members that that falls outside the scope of the program, which is not true if you look at the statutory requirements for the program. So we took all these findings, and one thing we did is wrote kind of one paper on this topic. And one of the things we found is that there is a lot of interest in the scholarly community about leveraging source water protection, so watershed programming, watershed planning, as a proactive policy solution for improving rural drinking water access. And there's a lot of reasons for this that I'm not going to go into, but in that literature, a lot of scholars have suggested that we need to, instead of doing voluntary planning, we need to do mandatory planning. And they've also argued that we need to concentrate watershed authority in singular agencies. And interestingly, SIGMA does both of these things. However, we kind of see this ongoing challenge of access to the process and also influence within the process. That means that rural drinking water users were really not having any benefits from this program whatsoever. And actually, in many cases, we're seeing this program as a threat to their water security rather than a potential improvement. And so this leads me to argue that there are more fundamental challenges with watershed planning that we need to grapple with. And that's particularly the historic and ongoing oppressions that mediate access in these spaces. So really going back to not just like the source of water, but the source of inequities themselves. But these challenges also really highlight a lot of room for potential improvement. And so in every interview, I asked interviewees for their ideas, their solutions, their recommendations for improving SIGMA implementation. And what we did with all of that was package it into a bilingual report where community members shared their own recommendations for what they wanted the state and local agencies to do regarding SIGMA. So For example, we highlighted that community members really wanted a more staggered incremental schedule to developing groundwater sustainability plans. And this was important to them, not just because it allowed for the communities to have more capacity to participate. Like no one can review a 900-page plan in 30 days. It's just not possible. So dragging out the schedule, making it more incremental, provides more community opportunity for participation. But they also stressed that this was important because each element in the plan feeds into another element. And they felt like they weren't getting to kind of have that upstream input that then would inform the broader planning process moving down. So we also kind of developed recommendations for expanding state funding for technical assistance and how those types of programs could support community participation in Sustainable Groundwater Management Act implementation. And what I did in addition to this report is that I actively participated in disseminating these findings. So I spoke at water policy events. I spoke at a California water law convention. We spoke with state agency staff. We went to the annual Groundwater Sustainability Agency Summit. Basically, anywhere we could go where they were talking about SGMA, we were then able to take these recommendations that were sourced from 27 communities and present those to decision makers at different venues. And I'll note that's kind of the work, some of the work I was leading and doing, but my partner organizations also regularly used these findings in their meetings, in their materials, in their kind of lobbying and policy activities as well. So another key finding from these interviews then was that many residents felt they lacked the expertise and the experience they needed to meaningfully engage in SGMA meetings. And to respond with this, I worked with my partners along with the Union of Concerned Scientists to develop materials and training opportunities that would be dedicated to supporting residents to participate in this process. And so this included kind of helping self-help enterprises redesign their rural community water managers leadership institute to have a focus on SGMA and focus on regional planning. We also designed and presented various community groundwater workshops. So one of those is pictured on the far right here. And these workshops included very hands-on activities like calculating water budgets for groundwater basins and role play activities where participants practice negotiating sustainable management criteria. And in many ways, you can think of these activities as a very traditional extension activity. But to me, kind of some of the key points that make them a little bit more nuanced is that they were based on self-identified needs from community partners and from interviewees, and that we integrated these trainings directly with the policy process. So for example, in those community groundwater workshops, we would usually go over the plan for that region, whether it was a draft plan or kind of wherever it was in the stage of development. And we would capture community comments and recommendations about their local draft plan, and then package those and submit them as a comment letter to the relevant agency, so that we were using the space of learning as also an opportunity for community members to provide direct information back to decision makers. So later on, when the first round of plans were submitted, so remember there was kind of two different timelines for plan submission. When the first round of plans were submitted, I worked with my partners to think about how we could participate in their review, because per SGMA, per the law, these plans had to be reviewed by and approved by the state before they became finalized. And so I worked with my partner organizations and various collaborators to develop a mixed method review of groundwater sustainability plans. And then we implemented this review for the 45 plans that were submitted. And this assessment had three components. We did a large spatial assessment that leveraged secondary data about drinking water users to summarize drinking water interests within each plan area. So that was like number of wells, population, number of public supply wells, what have you. We also did a structured document review of these plans using a human right to water scorecard that we developed. And I should note, like, these plans are like 900 even longer pages. So this was a very intensive, long and iterative process. And then other work we did, which was led by my colleague, Darcy Bostick, was to do some hydrological modeling to interpret, to take the criteria that were set forth in these plans and understand how they would affect drinking water wells, both domestic wells and public supply wells. So among the key results from this work is that many submitted plans failed to fully describe drinking water users within their boundaries. So, for example, 2/3 of plans lacked any information about domestic wells in their area, including number, location, depths, nothing. And while an improvement from the GSA notification phase that I documented in 2018, we found that still 1/4 of these plans were missing identification of low-income communities within their boundaries. We also found that the sustainable management criteria proposed within the plans poses a direct potential threat to drinking water users. So according to the hydrologic analysis that Darcy led, the groundwater levels that were proposed as sustainable under these plans had the potential to dewater as many as 67% of domestic wells in the Central Valley, which is what's mapped here on the screen. And then when it comes to water quality, it actually was even worse. Only 10% of submitted plans aligned their sustainability criteria for water quality with state and federal drinking water standards. So this means that the other 90% of plans either did not set any water quality criteria at all, or they set them at levels that are considered unsafe for human consumption. And so in other words, their local definition of sustainability was in no ways aligned with the Safe Drinking Water Act or kind of public health goals around drinking water. So drawing all this work together, we produced 2 research reports and a policy brief. And then again, to directly engage the state review process, we submitted public comments on each of these plans. So our public comments, which are pictured down here in the left, were like 8 to 13 pages per plan. And we did them all within the 75-day public review period. It was absolute mayhem. But there was this timeline set forth in the law for this public comment period. And it felt really important if we were going to do this work to make sure we did it on a timeline that could inform the policy process. And then also I continued to share our findings with policymakers. I participated in a legislative briefing on SIGMA implementation. And again, my partner organizations also did a lot of that work, sharing findings, using our results in meetings and whatnot. So as a bright note that I never thought we actually would have when we talked about this project is that this work, along with the really hard work of many, many others I haven't even referenced here, has really had an impact. So recently, the state of California rejected a good chunk of these plans, partly on their basis of their failure to assess or address drinking water impacts. And that's like explicitly laid out in the rejection letters, which we were really excited to see. And so now we're in this weird place as a state where regions are going back to the drawing board, and now they have state supervision in the process while they do it. And they're working towards resolving the issues that the state identified with their plans. And that's raising new questions, right? But it's also raising new opportunities to implement the suggestions that we developed over the course of this first 7 years of the process. We now have all these community recommendations. We've built a lot of capacity and interest. And it's kind of exciting to see it feed back into another phase of planning as we get kind of underway, even though I'll also admit that it's also somewhat exhausting to think that we're kind of going back to the drawing board for some of these things. So I'm going to wrap up then, but I do want to end on like one last slide about challenges and lingering questions. And these are things I find myself wrestling with, things that keep me up at night. And I think are also things that many of you here today have thoughts on and experiences with. And I'd love to kind of have these, to the extent you all are interested, be questions we discuss later on. But I think something I underestimated in taking a statewide cooperative extension role is how impossible it is to work with all relevant stakeholders, right? And I think we know this, but then when you get into the work, you kind of forget. And so I'm constantly having to decide who I work with and how. And I think this is relevant to all of our work, no matter what we work on. And it does really merit ongoing reflection because these choices have implications for the work we're doing. And this seems to be a question and a concern that is never leaving me as I move from position to position and like project to project. This is also related to really big challenges balancing a research agenda in the context of competing priorities, particularly for extension. I think extension is intended to serve, right? Serve the public. I'm intended to serve Californians, but there's so much heterogeneity there. And like how to balance a research agenda is really challenging and something I've been thinking a lot about. And I think another aspect of that is between long-term and short-term work. So as we speak, two of the communities that I've worked with for years on drinking water quality and access, including on Sigma, are under mandatory flood evacuations. And the powers that be in their county are making decisions about where to direct floodwaters, which is pegging rural low-income communities against the railroad and against really large farming landowners. And the emergency, right, that's happening right now doesn't negate these communities' interests in long-term drinking water work. But if extension work is going to serve Californians, I think there also is this need for pivoting and flexibility. And I'm not sure where the balance there is between short-term and long-term needs. I also never stop questioning what community engagement should look like for my various projects. I think this is a always changing thing that we do need to be constantly thinking about, but there really is a fine line, in my opinion, between community-driven research and extractive research. And for me, I define extractive research as a research that takes more than it gives to communities. And there's a really fine, unclear line between those two things. I think sometimes with the goal of being community-driven, we accidentally end up extracting when our intention is just exactly the opposite. Because collaborative projects take a lot of time and resources, and how to balance those two things, I don't have the answer for, but it's something I've been thinking a lot about. And then finally, kind of circling back to the beginning of the talk, as someone who does work on a non-Indigenous specific issues and has a statewide appointment, I'm really thinking still about what it means to be accountable for the settler colonial legacy of land grant. And, you know, what that looks like in work that, work that I do in water justice, which obviously has so many intersections, as every topic does with Indigenous communities, but where we find that overlap and that accountability in a system that really isn't designed to even acknowledge those roots, let alone address them. So with that, I will close out, and I look forward to discussion. Happy to take questions, but also really happy to hear people's experience and expertise with these various topics as well.
Thank you so much, Kristin. We are happy to take questions. I'm not totally sure, Audrey, what the plan is for Q&A versus chat questions. Maybe try and use the Q&A if you can. And also just a reminder that after questions, we will have a student reception. And so I think a link for that will end up in the chat at some point. So please, grad students, stick around for a little while after the Q&A. But yes, please ask questions. I think if people also wanted to ask verbal questions, maybe raise your hand and we can also call on you that way. Yes, Kristin, you have a question.
Couldn't decide which hand I
Yeah,
needed to raise.
that's okay.
Thanks. That was great talk. And you put a lot into it in terms of the ways that we can all be thinking of our respective situations. I wondered about the intersection between water supply and water quality, and how you prioritize that and in the work that you're doing, or how the communities you're working with are prioritizing that.
It is a good question, and actually a very timely one as we are in this moment of floods, which brings both into really stark contrast. My dissertation, a lot of my work previously has been on quantity primarily, and then with quality intersections. And some of that reflects that in California, quantity is regulated through a different agency than quality. And we have all these policy silos that in some ways, I think I've allowed my research agenda to also be kind of siloed, because if I'm trying to engage with a policy process and those policies are siloed, you kind of end up doing the same thing. But I do think that we are making some progress, and I think community members and partners are kind of making some progress of trying to integrate and speak across programs, because they are so related. So for example, with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, where they were willing to acknowledge drinking water, typically they'd only really acknowledge quantity and didn't want to acknowledge quality. And they would say there's these other programs for water quality. Technically, that's not like, actually, they are supposed to manage quality as well. And so finding ways to intersect them, I think, is key. And we're kind of doing that more right now with recharge. So the governor just issued an executive order to cut red tape to implement groundwater recharge, as we have all these historic floodwaters in California. It is, a exciting opportunity from a quantity standpoint, but cutting quality analyses has huge implications for drinking water sources, and it's very concerning to a lot of stakeholders. And so I think we are even seeing that, like, those siloed conversations are actually maybe kind of like getting back at us, of like there's so much conversation about the need to recharge that we've now put some policy eggs in that basket and are like, oh shoot, that we ended up with something that we didn't want. So I think it speaks to the need to integrate them. I think the policy process is a challenge for doing so rather than an opportunity. But certainly the conversation on the community side and the community organization side of the connections has increased a ton in the last couple of years. So I'm excited to see where that can take us with some new projects that maybe try to engage several policy processes at the same time, for example.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Jesse. So thanks for this presentation. Obviously, the lens of your work here is through water, but I'm curious where, if anywhere, you see your findings or methods informing concurrent efforts on other topics like air quality, and how.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of intersections. In part, in the last decade, 2 decades, we have seen huge movement towards decentralized, like watershed, airshed scale planning. And that is a movement that is kind of across the board in environmental planning and environmental policy, is decentralized collaborative management. And that's it's interesting in the natural resources, right? We talk about as collaborative governance, but there's a lot of parallels in even urban planning. And, it's kind of in every field, just with a different slightly terminology. I mean, I think where a lot of my work can speak to those intersections is we often think of those projects as new, and we're like, oh, look, we're going to do this groundwater collaborative, and here we go, and it's new. But really, we're building on, decades, if not centuries, of policy and social landscape. And that's going to directly inform what we come up with. So, in 2017, when I first did my analysis of who was represented on groundwater sustainability agencies, and we had 17% of 250 low-income communities, that's a direct reflection of the social landscape where these communities were not in conversation with water managers. These communities were not in conversation kind of with the actors that were forming these groups. And so I think we find ourselves kind of, no matter what the resource or the topical issue is, needing to understand history. And that was kind of my point in saying, like, when we think about source water protection as a drinking water strategy, source what? Like, it's certainly the source of water, but also the source of these inequities. And we have to be going back to those and understanding the ways in which our political and social landscapes are informing these processes, because otherwise we're just replicating the wheel. And we've done that, by and large. A lot of what we've done with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in California is replicating the wheel. And I'm grateful that we have some of these stop guards in place where we're going to go back and try again now for a lot of these. But I think that that's one big lesson And then the other lesson that I didn't speak to here, but I'll just briefly mention, so I've done some work looking at how representation influences outcomes. And one of the big lessons there is that it helps, but maybe not as much as we would like to think. Like, it's not just about getting people to the table, but there's really these unequal power dynamics that happen at the table that can render participation not that impactful with outcomes. And I think that is a big thing we spend a lot of time on in water governance, is thinking about representation. And I'm hoping with future work, like unpacking representation and not assuming representation means it's someone's influential or having an impact on outcomes, I think is another lesson that we can take to a lot of different resources or contexts.
Great, thank you. Shating asks, California is also facing a housing crisis, and cities had greatly increased requirements for building housing, increased density. Where does planning for drinking water happen in these conversations around growth? How do we have housing justice and drinking water justice?
It's a great question. I encourage the person who asked it to look up my colleague, Dr. Greg Pierce at UCLA, who's done some work on this intersection. I am by no means an expert on this topic, but I think there's a couple elements here. By and large, drinking water consumption of water is not the main use. It's like, certainly in the state of California, we think of the main user being agriculture and industry, but even if we think in a city, it's landscaping, it's not drinking water. And so I don't think from the outset, I think thinking of housing as at odds with like kind of water security or water justice, I just think isn't quite the right frame, but we do see it a lot in policy conversations, and limited water supplies is frequently being used to block particularly affordable housing developments in California. And I know this is happening elsewhere as well. So those things are being presented as in tension. But I guess for me, I think they're compatible. I do think in California, there's some work right now around a right to housing and a right to housing movement, right to housing policy in California. And we in the water justice community are in conversation with housing advocates because we passed the human right to water in California in 2012. And so there's been some really cool movement and policy conversations between those two sectors of what does a human right to something give us? What are the limitations to that type of policy? So just from my own experience, there's increasing synergy between those movements, and I am hopeful by that. But sometimes the broader dialogue is certainly one of conflict.
Rebecca, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Kristin. That was really interesting. I was wondering if you could riff a little bit about your comment and observations and scholarship on the representation not really meaning as much. And specifically, I'm wondering if you could talk about, how the culture of those processes and meetings might lead to that representation not being so important, and culture change that you might see changing that outcome.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a good one I've been thinking a lot about recently. I like a couple points from my research, and then I'll think a little bit about cultural change. So one thing we found when we did the interviews, a lot of the people we interviewed were participating either with formal roles or just as kind of informally in these processes. And there was like a surprisingly amount similarities between those two groups. I expected to see a lot more difference between people who had a formal voting role and people who didn't in kind of their perceptions of the process. And by and large, we didn't see that. We had a lot of primarily comments of like the people who had voting representation said, I'm one vote on a board of 9. I'm one vote on a board of 12. Every other person is an agricultural water manager in this region. They were like, it doesn't actually matter. Like there was a lot of people telling us that their vote didn't actually matter because they were just outvoted. And then between those two groups, the informally represented participating people and the people who had formal spots, similarly, both didn't feel empowered to speak up. Similarly, both felt very marginalized in terms of drinking water and rural communities in these conversations. And so that was kind of the first finding of this, of like, oh, it's a lot more about the culture of the meeting and the that. And then in a paper just recently published in Policy Studies Journal, we actually used machine learning techniques, boosted regression trees, to try to parse out if we could find an effect of representation on groundwater sustainability plan outcomes. And we do see one. There is a positive relationship there. But one of the most interesting things we noted was that you actually needed to get like 40% of the board representing drinking water to have that effect, which is exactly what folks told us. So like, great testament to mixed methods. That's exactly what folks told us, is if you don't have at least a meaningful representation on the board, it doesn't necessarily, result in change. And so to me, that exactly points to the need for culture change and thinking about how we run these meetings, how we do decision-making processes, because realistically, at least in a lot of the places I work in the Central Valley, where it's not realistic to get 40% of a board to be drinking water users, right? Like that's a dream that's probably not going to be accomplished in most places. And so to me, that directs our attention to meeting culture, to meeting facilitation, and to social relationships. And this might seem like an aside, but like I mentioned, Allensworth and Alpa facing catastrophic floodings right now. Alpa is the first, it was founded in 1911 by Colonel Allensworth. It's the first town founded entirely by African-Americans in California, and has a state historic park. It's a really incredible place. And that community is now primarily farm worker Latino, and they are facing catastrophic flooding. And there's some really cool solidarity happening between white landowners and those communities right now. There's also some real tensions with other landowners. But I think, to me, one of the lessons there, right, is like through social relationships, like these conversations can be changed. There can be more common understanding. There can be more perspective of who's winning and like how can we all be like better off when those relationships exist. And I speak to Allensworth because those relationships have been built over the last 10, 15 years. And in this moment of crisis are really paying dividends to like see in a place. And I don't think we would see that in another community that doesn't have connections with those types of connections with water management agencies and whatnot. So I'm really interested in this question of like social capital, social learning and building and fostering relationships and how that might change the tenor and culture of these meetings, even without stacking a board with 40% drinking water users. Yeah, I think that's something that's worth thinking more about.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions. We have 2 more in the Q&A. So one is also interested in how you see technology manifesting in these conversations. As we think about conservation efforts, energy efforts, et cetera, community voice is so vital in sitting and planning, but breaking the technical and social barrier is tricky. Have you seen examples in your work of tools or digital facilitation resources that really shine?
So I get a couple thoughts, because I think the question is asking technical in terms of like Zoom and like is that the case? But also there's this question of like groundwater is a highly technical subject matter. So which of those two?
Jesse, I don't know if you want to elaborate.
Hi, yeah, this is Jesse. I was thinking, I guess, more the latter, but now I'm interested in both, of course.
Great, thanks for the clarification. I'll say regarding the latter, that was a big focus of why we ended up developing the Getting Involved with Groundwater guide, and why we started doing these community groundwater workshops. Is it is a huge barrier, and I think unnecessarily so. There's a lot of jargon and ways in which these meetings are presented as not accessible in a way that I think is strategic, and I think is intended to keep certain people in control of the process by making it seem so obtuse that nobody else can engage. But they're groundwater, just like any other topic, people know a lot about it, and through lived experiences, there's a lot of community expertise about how water quality has changed with different groundwater conditions, what different, times of year wells struggle, whatnot. Like there is a lot of lived expertise in groundwater. And so I think where we've had the most success is doing capacity building, but also building up that lived expertise and kind of clarifying how groundwater intersects with kind of all the other work people are doing. And at times trying to push back in meetings explicitly and make it more accessible. But yeah, it is such a huge challenge. That getting involved in groundwater guide, I think, is a really good example. And that was led by the Union of Concerned Scientists, of trying to make something more tractionable and like help people get involved. But it's been a huge issue. One of the roles that technical assistance providers have played in this process across the state is, in some cases, technical assistance providers have been able to get funding to do one-on-one support with board members. So this was in cases where we had board members sitting on groundwater sustainability agencies from communities who didn't have technical expertise. And we had technical assistance providers who were able to help prep them with their materials, go over it, one-on-one, kind of type of capacity building to really try to help them leverage that position effectively. So that has worked. It's really hard to scale that up though, right? It takes a lot of resources and time to do that type of support. But I'll just mention on the digital side, I didn't say this in the talk, but obviously a good portion of Sigma implementation has happened during COVID, and that has been a huge, huge barrier. It has been kind of a nightmare to transition these really complicated technical conversations that we were really trying to build social relationships into a digital virtual platform. And I do think really hurt the process, quite frankly. And I don't think we've cracked that nut. But if we're thinking about meeting culture, it's like that much harder, honestly, on Zoom. And that I just am pointing that out as like, I think something that really had an effect on this process that I or anyone else I know hasn't articulated, but I think it had a big effect, and is still a really big issue in a region that has really limited broadband connectivity, limited cell service. There was a lot of people who were really shut out of the process by the move to a virtual.
I'm going to let us do this one last question because I think it's an important one. So Forrest asks, I'm puzzled by the contradiction between the need for burdened communities to engage in the policy process in order to achieve better outcomes, but the added burden of time and energy from already burdened people to have to engage in these meetings. That might be costly for them. How do you engage in this?
Yeah, I struggle with this too. And I would say I would extend that same contradiction and tension to collaborative research. Like I think and I think it's worth thinking about and continuing to wrestle with, even when it doesn't feel like there's good answers, because I agree. I was raised in an unincorporated community in Utah with significant drinking water and wastewater issues. My hometown of Pinecrest has 30 households, and those households need to run a water board through volunteers. We need to do fire maintenance on our fire, anyways, the community I grew up in, there's 30 households, and the amount of work you have to spread over those people just for the water system. And then when you start thinking about fire planning and all these other things, the burden on 30 households, and really you only have 10 households who maybe participate of the 30, right? It's huge. So that's like my lived experience is very much one of understanding what it means to ask rural and disenfranchised residents to do this work. And that's part of why I'm interested in this question of participation, because if participation is not accomplishing what we think it is or want it to be, there's huge cost to pushing participation. And I think that I think it's worth more scholarly and practical attention to that question, because there are huge costs to these things. And, the proliferation of policy venues through collaborative governance and decentralized management is huge. So first, I have no answers, and it's just a huge tension I sit with as well. And yeah, I think it merits a lot more thinking when extending to research, but also just in policy processes and representation. And I think sometimes about the concept of associativity between small communities and because small communities often, especially the ones I've worked with, when it comes to groundwater, have very shared interests. And maybe we don't need all 10 communities in this region to show up. Maybe we just need one, and there's a way by which they're representing collectively, How do we think about various mechanisms for associations and representation and solidarity between these communities that help spread the burden? I don't know. I have no answers. I'm just lamenting because it's a big thing.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. Grad students, once again, there is a link in the chat. I'm going to stay in this Zoom room, so hopefully you don't get kicked and you're able to sort of transfer from one Zoom to the other carefully. But yeah, everyone, if we could thank Kristin again for joining us, and thank you all so much for joining the seminar.
Thanks for having me.